Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a well-known professional and a leadership expert, a leadership development guru from Orlando, Florida, USA, Yogi Mueller. Yogi, welcome to the show.
Good morning, Ash. Thank you so much for having me on. I
Thank
appreciate it.
you.
It's an honor.
Thank you. Yogi is the owner and chief craftsman of Craft Leadership LLC. His signature framework, Embrace the Grit, emphasizes resilience, adaptability, and personal growth. So, Yogi, my first question, tell me a little bit about your own journey and when did you realize that leadership was your calling?
That's a great question. If I look back at my life, it was never one singular pursuit towards leadership or in the world of talent development. No matter what I was doing, I had a foot or a hand in either one of those. And it wasn't until I started really with the Walt Disney Company where I started to realize my passion and my prowess, I guess, in leadership and in talent development. And I started kind of putting those things together and saying, I've been pretty successful as a leader, and I'm passionate about watching people grow and having that development arc in there, and putting those two together. My career path finally joined into one, and for the past 30 or so years, I've been in talent, leadership development, and leadership.
You know, the Walt Disney Company is probably one of the most iconic companies for talent development in the world. And the fact that you earned your spurs there says it all.
Oh,
My
spurs, scars, bruises.
yes, yes. Scars at my age, I'm older than you. There are lots of scars in any case. Absolutely. But Yogi, what inspired you to start craft leadership? And how has that journey transformed you personally?
Great question. I'm a fan of cocktails,
Mhm.
and I love the craft cocktail and watching them with the tweezers and the dry ice and whatever they're doing. And last year, I decided to actually start the journey to maybe do a podcast of my own.
Mm-hmm.
And a friend of mine, a partner, and I were going to call it Craft Leadership. And we were going to start, and we still have plans for this, by the way. So start with talking about a whiskey or a spirit, and then tie that directly to a leadership topic, bring in a special guest. And so that's where it kind of started. In 2024, I was freed up to pursue my entrepreneurial dreams by a company acquisition. I'm like, well, let's put up the shingle and let's say, hey, let's design a whole talent development firm around this concept of a bespoke, hands-on, very crafted, artistic kind of approach to developing you, your team, or your organization.
Well said. So let's talk about craft leadership now. Tell me about the scope of work that you handle at Craft Leadership, and how do you approach turning a leadership challenge into a clear, actionable strategy?
So my clients range anywhere from an individual learning that they're not very good at public speaking and facilitation, to organizations that are defining their leadership culture. They're growing so fast, they haven't had a chance to really put a solid leadership culture foundation under their growth. But every one of them, again, is that bespoke approach, and it's very individual to the team, and most specifically to the individual. It's a labor of love, and I feel most effectively that when you get into the heart of the matter, this is the kind of part of the second part of your question, is you can start moving the mountains a little bit, because you develop that authentic relationship with them, and it's usually mirrored back by an authentic relationship and personality of the other person. And that's where the real growth begins, right? I'm a firm believer. I use this technique called sandpaper learning, kind of in that craft leadership thing, where to put a finishing piece on a furniture, like if you're finishing a chest, you got to rough it up a little bit to put that final coat on. And so we talk about really kind of gritty, get in there, rough it up a little bit with that sandpaper, really look at your rough edges, smooth them out so you can put that final coat on.
Great response. And in a fast-paced environment, How can a leader maintain clarity and direction without losing their team?
Two things: authenticity and communication. I think when you are presenting yourself as you are, and that is your strengths, your opportunities, even sometimes your fears, to really let them know that, hey, I'm in the same boat you are. I think regardless of how fast or how crazy things are going, if you are saying, look, I get it, I've been there, I'm doing it, but I'm with you, and we're
Mm,
strong, and we're going to move forward.
mm,
And I don't know if you grew up with this game called Mad Libs
mhm.
in India,
Yeah.
but it's a sheet of paper that has blank spaces on it, and people fill in the words to complete the story.
Mm,
Well, my thing is, look, if you're not giving them the words to fill in those blanks,
mm.
people fill it in with their own words, and
Yeah.
they tend to be very negative, nihilistic, and
Mm,
destructive. So the
right.
more communication information you provide, I think the better you're going to be.
Wow. And what is your process to help leaders simplify chaos without oversimplifying the problem?
I think getting clarity in their mind first. One of the things that I love doing is really digging in with individuals and helping them see perspectives.
Mhm.
Whether you call it EQ, whether you call it systemic thinking, you can put a couple different names on it. But to get into somebody's thought process and kind of dismantle it a little bit, and then talk about impact and stakeholders and yes, feelings, especially when it comes to interpersonal issues,
Mm,
and then presenting them in a way that they go, oh, yeah, I never considered that. And then
mm,
that opens up new avenues for them to approach.
Well said. And when leaders face resistance from their teams, what practical strategies do you recommend to them?
I love quotes. I love little fun sayings, and I like one key does not unlock every door. And a
Mhm.
lot of times when I see that resistance that the team has,
Mm,
it's not because they don't know how to do something.
mm,
It is because there are other factors involved. Are they in
mm,
the wrong seat? Is there bad accountability? Is there bad culture? And so when you provide those open doors and you provide that new perspective of thinking, and folks come back and you go, hey, it's not that they don't know what they're doing, they're just not doing it because of you.
right.
That one key, you figure out what that key that unlocks that leaders, and then you go, there's no shotgun approaches, there's no one blanket answer to move the team members. If you have five people on your team, they're there for five different reasons. You need to
Mm,
find out what that is,
mm,
and then develop a plan that can reach that individual, and not
mm.
just, again, that blanket approach.
Fascinating. Yogi, of your signature framework is embrace the grit. What does
Yes.
embrace the grit mean in practice? And how did you come up with this framework?
So embrace the grit is that concept of that sandpaper learning, right? Where that it's one thing for somebody to use sandpaper on it, but the wood that you're working on, the furniture, does not resist the sandpaper. Well, if I'm trying to work with you and you're trying to really grow as a leader, as a professional,
Mhm,
uh, that you need to be open to that grit.
mhm,
So embrace the grit stands for get over yourself,
mhm,
reassess with honesty, invest in improvement, and treasure the lessons and growth. The
mhm,
first two, get over yourself and reassess, is your ability to listen to feedback, to process the feedback, and understand there's kernels of truth in all feedback. The
mhm.
second part, invest and treasure, is what are you going to do with that feedback? Listening is only 50% of it,
Yeah.
right? 50%, the other 50% is doing something about it. So what we do is we walk through a series of kind of mental exercises to really do some of that self-reflection, understand where the resistance to feedback might be coming from, and then why they're not investing in it. I think before you build any leadership program, whether it's a mentorship program, whether it's a young leader program or internship program,
Mm.
you need to be able to have individuals in there that can grow, that is that sponge for information.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if you have people that are resistant,
Mhm,
wasting money in
mhm,
investing in them.
mhm. There's also the elements of resilience, adaptability, and personal growth. Can you break down each of these elements and why they matter in leadership? And if possible, give me an example for each of them.
So the resilience part comes with to be able to take the barrage of feedback.
Mm.
I have a book coming out in a few months called The Great Slapping,
Oh,
and it's about
congratulations.
the power of mentorship. And sometimes you get proverbially slapped
Mm.
by your mentors,
Mm.
and that resilience is to be able to get through that the noise of feedback, to get through that ego that you have, right? And to be able to see the truths in there and move through that forest
Mm.
and be productive and fix that when it needs to be fixed.
Mm.
Um, the other two are come from that. Once you're through that forest, then the rest of it's fairly easy to get through, and
Mm.
that's that growth and that moving forward. Because again, if you don't know where you're stepping off or where your mistakes are,
Mm.
every 2 or 3 steps you make, you're going to take a step backwards. You're not going to make that forward move.
Yeah.
You're building on a foundation of sand, as they say,
Mm.
and embracing the grit gives that strong foundation for which you build your next level of growth on.
Mm. Great response. My next question, Yogi, is many leaders struggle with authenticity, and you have spoken of authenticity just a few minutes back. How does your framework encourage leading with purpose and clarity?
So I just did a video. I do a weekly kind of video update called the Leadership Nuggets. And the last one that I did this week, I'm doing a 4-part series on fear. And the first one is we really need to focus on why we fear something versus what we fear.
Yeah.
And if when you dig into that, a lot of times people fear their brand
Mm.
and what it's going to happen to their brand. And
Mm.
so they fill in their own mad libs, as they say, with very nihilistic kind of understanding of being authentic. Well, if I can't be authentic, they're going to tear me apart. And
Mm.
the answer is no. And so when I work with a leader, we figure out where their kernel of fear is and why they fear not being authentic, where they fear vulnerability. I'm a big fan of Brene Brown, and she's very much about vulnerability. And as a leader, that humanizes you, that connects you. It doesn't mean you're less confident. If you talk to a soldier in a battle, they're going to tell you they're terrified, but they still charge forward.
Yeah.
Okay, well, they understood why they feared, and they worked around it to be able to do what they need to do.
Mm.
Leaders are the same way. Unfortunately, you don't have bullets flying over your head,
Mm.
but if you go in thinking you're physically going to be vulnerable, or your brand or your personality, your image is going to be vulnerable, you're going to be hesitant and not make those strong connections.
Mm. Very well said. My next question, Yogi, is how do you challenge leaders to step outside their comfort zones without overwhelming them?
That's a great question, and I'll go back to my statement earlier, Ash, that it's not one key that unlocks every door,
Mm.
right? Because there are leaders that I speak to that can take tough stuff right at them,
Mm.
and there's others that will overwhelm them, right? So I still I'm tough with them. I still get that sandpaper and I rough them up a little bit,
Mm.
but I've got to understand what the material is. I'm not a woodworker, but I'm assuming you don't approach a hickory the
Yeah.
same way you would a pine, right? And so the end result is the same, but the process, that even the tools
Mm.
are different. But it's again based on that very, very personalized approach to ensure that they're getting the best results that we can.
Well said. What, in your view, are some of the common blind spots you see in senior leaders, and how do you help them to course correct?
I, it's a lot of the ones that I have seen, Ash, are on that concept that when they get to a certain level,
Mm.
they seem to become less human.
Mm.
And one of the things that you had provided me to kind of explore in my answers was, I've worked with several organizations. I've
Yeah.
worked with global
Yeah.
organizations, and I've worked with small kind of mom and pop, but it's still 5,000-6,000 people.
Mm.
The bigger the company is, the more important is that connection that you have with your rank and file. And it's almost this correlated move. The bigger the company gets, the more separated
Mm.
you get from, as they say in the food and beverage, the farther from the hamburger.
Mm.
right? And you forget and you lose those connections, and you cease to become
Mm.
an inspirational leader. You're more of like some god sitting on Mount Olympus.
Right.
And we need to work through, again, a lot of that comes from that fear that we talked about
Mm-hmm.
in terms of that brand. I can imagine with the 30,000 followers that you had in the thousands of podcasts that you've done, you've encountered people that are making decisions in their day-to-day business life based on that fear
Correct.
of perceptions of vulnerability and things like that. So again, it's exploring the whys behind that.
Very interesting. What is your approach to giving, in inverted commas, or quote unquote, tough love feedback during coaching conversations?
It's developing that rapport and trust, right? As you know, one of the roadblocks to feedback is not understanding the why behind why somebody's giving you feedback.
Mm.
If you don't establish that trust, and that other individual doesn't realize or recognize that you are delivering that to build them up, not tear them down,
Mm-hmm.
right? You can be tough and you can be very frank, and you say,
Mm-hmm.
look, this is what we call a career limiting move. Keeping that, you're
Mm-hmm.
gone, right? With that individual. However, if that trust in the relationship is established, they know it is an investment in them,
Mm-hmm.
not to tear them down, right? It would be more detrimental to not mention their self-destructive behavior. Let's say if we're in the extremes, and let them go and do their thing.
Mm-hmm.
That, I think, is the worst approach.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are an individual, if you are a leader that has to give very tough feedback, tough love to somebody, make sure there is that understanding of trust. Uh, Years ago, when I was a manager at Disney, I remember I had to reprimand this one guy for he did something that was pretty cut and dry, blatant safety issue, and he approached me afterwards, and I thought he was going to chew me out, and he said, "Nope, nope, I deserved it, and I appreciated you giving me that feedback." And I think that was one of my earlier, leadership lessons, that if you do it the right way and you show that you are doing this as a benefit to them and investing in them, it's going to be okay.
Mm-hmm. And yet, I've often come across very senior leaders who love to get feedback but not receive it. What are your perspectives on this?
It's like throwing water in a bucket that has holes in the bottom of it,
Yeah.
right? It's, again, listening to feedback is only 50% of it. And how many times have you come across organizations that maybe do an employee surveys, and then you hear, but we never do anything about it, we never hear anything, and it becomes the flavor of the month. It becomes this disingenuous kind of ask. And again, when you become too far from the hamburger, where you're too far separated from your frontline
Mm-hmm.
employee, and just, as you were telling me about your just incredible career and all the major accomplishments that you've done over the decades, you started someplace, and and you were that ground level, entry level person to start your amazing journey. Well, if you are going to be a successful leader, never forget where you came from.
Correct.
Always have that tie to that backbone of your operation,
Mm.
and you will be incredibly successful.
Mm.
Um, and so I think what they do is they do the pomp and circumstance of, oh, we're asking for feedback, but because they don't have a tie to what their frontline is experiencing, the desire to do anything with it becomes a passe thing. The excitement is in asking for the feedback and not the challenge of actually doing something about it.
Great response. You'll give time for two more questions for you.
Yes, please.
Um, I've often also seen leaders who talk about building a culture of candid feedback and open communication. I've also seen the same thing with startup founders. And yet, when it comes to leaders and these founders, startup founders, they often say, "Oh, I'm the boss. It doesn't apply to me." I'd love to get your perspective on what advice would you give leaders who want to build a culture of candid feedback and open communication?
One of the leaders, the past leaders that I admire is Herb Kelleher. and was I think he was the founder, but definitely CEO of Southwest Airlines for a long, long, long time. Wrote a book called Nuts about his approach. And, he was somebody that really kind of opened the door to that suggestion box concept, right? And really opened the door for employees to speak their mind, to say, hey, what do you think is what we should be doing? And because of that, they grew amazingly fast. He became a very successful CEO and always had an approach that I admired. Right. I think, again, it goes back to ego. It goes back to fear. Even the concept of delegation, which I've always talked about, is the hardest managerial skill to develop.
Yeah.
Because it's the trust. It's the trust in the other people. And I got to tell you, I tell a story in my book coming up where I trusted too much, and not in a bad way. I had a very, very capable director reporting to me, talented individual, and I loved her. She was amazing. And one day I would say things like, well, if you think that's the right thing to do, I would say, I trust you implicitly. And gave her a lot of leeway and freedom. But she came back to me one day. She goes, I really appreciate the trust, but sometimes I just need a leader. And so, the trust is, it's not just about saying it, it's about showing it. And if you as a leader are so shaky about your ego, shaky about your reputation, shaky about giving somebody else input in your quote unquote baby, you got some work to do, because there's going to come a time where your company is growing so big, and if you can't get your grubby hands off of things and delegate where you're supposed to, you're only going to go so far. So I think for CEOs, and especially startups, to me, that would be the farm of amazing ideas where the energy is high and the feedback is coming through. And you've hired and fired hundreds of thousands of people, Ash. And I don't think there's one person you've ever hired that you didn't hire because you thought they could do a good job. So if you're paying them, let them do their job.
Absolutely. Great response. Yogi, my last question for you.
Yeah.
If there's one leadership trait that you believe is underrated, but absolutely essential, what is it and why?
I honestly, I'm going to go back, Ash, and I'm going to talk about that authenticity piece.
Okay.
And I know it's become a buzzword these days.
Yeah.
But there are CEOs that you even want to look at because they shine so brightly, right? To me, that doesn't create a culture. That creates an anti-culture in your organization. If you walk by a CEO and they stop what they're doing, turn and shake your hand, and even better, know your name in a company with several thousand people, you've just made a loyal employee for life. And that simple getting over yourself, which is the G and embrace the grit, I think is probably the key ingredient to being an amazing leader.
Wow. And on that amazing note of how important authenticity is for every leader, thank you, Yogi, for talking to me about your own amazing journey. I mean, I've spoken to so many people from Disney, and I always marvel at what an amazing organization that Disney has been. I've only seen it as a consumer, to have built amazing traits, outstanding training programs, and of course, talent development. Thank you for talking to me about craft leadership, about embrace the grit, about resilience, adaptability, and personal growth, about some of the blind spots, about tough love feedback, and of course, all the very best for your forthcoming book. When it's out, let me know, and I'd love to have another conversation with you about your book as well.
I would be honored.
And good luck.
My pleasure. Thank you. And I would like to close with a quote from Walt Disney that I think ties. He goes, "You can build the most amazing thing in the world, but it takes people to make it a reality."
So
that's
true.
where you should be.
So true. Thank you for this. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the brand called You.